"It gets better," she said, tapping the communication console. They sent a message. The wall screen flickered to life. The face that appeared was scaled, angular, and utterly without warmth. The face of a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of taking things that didn't belong to them. The Vraxian commander's vertical pupils contracted as he spoke, his translated voice arriving flat and cold through the colony's audio system. "Human colony of Kepler 186F. This planet and its resources are hereby claimed by the Vraxian Dominion. You have one planetary rotation to surrender all personnel and infrastructure without resistance. Non-compliance will result in your complete annihilation. Choose wisely." The screen went dark. Silence filled the command center so completely that Elena could hear the hum of the ventilation system. "Well," she said pleasantly, setting down her coffee, "at least they are giving us time to pack." Governor Mills dropped into the nearest chair as if his legs had simply decided to stop participating. "We need to evacuate. Immediately." "With what?" Elena asked. "Our shuttle holds 12 people at maximum capacity, and that's if everyone agrees not to breathe simultaneously. The next supply vessel isn't due for 3 weeks. We contact Air Command." "Already done. The fastest they can get a response fleet here is 48 hours. Best case scenario." Elena's voice was calm, unnervingly calm. "The Vraxians will be in orbit in 12. The room detonated into noise. Suggestions flew like shrapnel. Immediate surrender, desperate evacuation relays, hiding in the cave systems north of the colony, sending distress beacons to neighboring outposts that were days away. People talked over each other with the frantic energy of those who have just realized the ground beneath them is considerably less solid than they thought. Elena stood at the center of it all and said nothing. Inside her head, a very different conversation was taking place. Right on schedule, she thought. 3 years and 2 months. They took longer than projected, but they came exactly as predicted. Everything is in place. Everything is ready. It's time. Everyone. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in its texture, something layered and certain, that cut through the chaos like a signal through static. The room fell silent. "We are not surrendering," Elena said, "and we are not running." Mills looked at her with the expression of a man holding on to sanity by his fingernails. "Then what in God's name do you suggest, Commander?" Elena's lips curved into a smile. It was not an entirely comfortable smile to be on the receiving end of. Several of the senior staff shifted unconsciously in their seats. "I suggest," she said softly, "that we win." The main hydroponics bay was the only space in New Opportunity large enough to hold all 50 colonists simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, it smelled of earth and engineered chlorophyll and something faintly sweet that Dr. Chen had never fully explained. Tonight, under the emergency lighting, with 50 frightened faces arranged in anxious rows between the crop rows, it felt more like a church than a greenhouse. Elena stood before them with her hands clasped behind her back and let the silence settle before she spoke. "I know what you're thinking," she began, pacing slowly. "We're finished. Completely, utterly, cosmically finished. And you're right, if we play by conventional rules." She stopped and turned to face them. "So we're not going to." She paused to let that land. "What none of you know is that before I arrived here, I spent 12 years running black operation for Earth Special Forces. My specialty was asymmetric warfare, designing victory conditions for situations where conventional military logic said none existed, taking down technologically superior opponents using ingenuity, misdirection, and whatever happened to be lying around." The murmurs that moved through the crowd were low and disbelieving. "The Jupiter incident that got me reassigned here wasn't a diplomatic failure. It was a classified operation. 3 Centauran battleships were positioning for a surprise attack on the Europa station. My team neutralized all 3 using a repurposed communications satellite, 2 mining charges, and a modified waste management drone." She looked at their faces. "We had 12 minutes. We used 9. Dr. Chen stepped forward from the side of the room. Before Elena could continue, something in his posture had shifted. The mild-mannered scientist with his tablet and his careful words had straightened into something else entirely. He looked, suddenly, like a man who had been waiting 3 years for this moment. "My research here," he said carefully, "has not been exclusively agricultural. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. The compounds we developed, synthesized from local flora in combination with engineered Earth organisms, have properties that go well beyond crop yield optimization. He pulled up a holographic display from his tablet, rotating molecular structures in the air before him. Compounder rapidly degrades specific metal alloys used in Vraxian combat armor. Compound B disrupts electronic systems operating within a certain frequency range, specifically the range used by Vraxian military technology. Compound C creates localized, sustained electromagnetic interference when aerosolized. He looked at the crowd. All three can be produced in sufficient quantities using our existing synthesis equipment within 6 hours. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Elena continued, pulling up schematics of the colony's infrastructure on the main display. As she spoke, each familiar system transformed on the screen into something unrecognizable. The agricultural drones can be reprogrammed for precision compound dispersal across designated target zones. The irrigation system, with minimal modification to 3 bypass valves, can be used to flood the terrain surrounding the colony, turning firm ground into a mobility trap. The atmospheric analyzers can broadcast targeted electromagnetic pulses on Vraxian communication frequencies. The weather modification array can generate localized fog dense enough to reduce visibility to near zero while simultaneously disrupting their sensor systems. She paused and looked at them, all 50 of them, farmers and scientists and engineers and medics, and something in her expression shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more honest. New Opportunity was never just an agricultural colony, she said. It was designed, from the ground up, as a test bed for next-generation adaptive defense systems, military technology disguised as civilian infrastructure. Every system, every building, every piece of equipment, dual purpose. The silence that followed was profound. You didn't think to tell us. It was Governor Mills who said it, his voice very quiet and very controlled. Need to know basis, Elena replied. We were the bait, someone called from the back. A young botanist named Arjun, who Elena knew had a background in structural engineering. His voice wasn't accusing. It was simply precise. Strategic asset is a preferred terminology. Elena held his gaze. But yes, essentially, a trap requires bait. She looked around the room, and you all performed magnificently. 3 years of authentic, genuine, completely convincing colonist behavior. No one suspected because there was nothing to suspect. You were real. Your lives here were real. Your work was real. She let that settle. It still is. Another silence, longer this time. Then Arjun spoke again. What's the plan? Elena smiled. I'm glad you asked. It's an absolutely terrible plan that will almost certainly get us all killed or save everyone in record time. She pulled up the colony map and the surrounding terrain, overlaid with 4 projected Vraxian landing vectors. We're going to let them land. Then we're going to hit them with everything we have in ways their tactical computers have never been programmed to anticipate. She looked at the map, then at the people. 7 minutes. That's all we need. The hydroponics bay transformed from a place of fear into a place of furious, focused purpose. Colonists who had spent 3 years learning to be farmers discovered, in the space of a single night, that they had also, quietly, carefully, unknowingly, been learning to be soldiers. Scientists cross-referenced compound synthesis protocols. Engineers rewired drone control systems. Medical staff converted examination rooms into holding facilities. The agricultural settlement hummed and shifted and tightened itself, like a fist closing around something it had been waiting a very long time to grip. None of them slept. Captain Kroll stood on the command deck of the inevitable Conquest, a name the Vraxian Dominion had chosen, as it chose all its warship names, with the blunt confidence of an empire that had not lost a ground engagement in 63 years. He was 7 feet of scaled, battle-hardened certainty, his posture a perfect architectural expression of contempt. His second-in-command, Vorik, stood at the tactical display reading sensor data with a professional disinterest of someone reporting on a foregone conclusion. Minimal defenses confirmed. Captain. No orbital platforms detected. No planetary shield. No significant energy weapon signatures. Their only spacecraft is a small transport shuttle currently docked at the main structure. Vorik looked up. They have approximately 50 life signs, mostly biological profiles consistent with scientists and agricultural workers. Kroll's mandibles clicked in the Vraxian equivalent of a smile. They send farmers to hold worlds. He turned to survey his officers, veterans of 14 successful conquests, men and women who had reduced more impressive colonies than this to minerals and memory. It is almost beneath us. Shall we proceed with orbital bombardment? Captain, his tactical officer suggested. No. The word was quick and firm. Orbital bombardment is a waste of resources on a target this small. And honestly, Kroll's vertical pupils narrowed. I want my troops to have the satisfaction. Standard conquest formation. 200 ground soldiers. We'll have complete control within 1 planetary hour. His tactical officer hesitated. With respect, Captain, 200 soldiers seems excessive for 50 unarmed. The Dominion does not take chances. Kroll cut him off. And I do not leave tasks unfinished. He studied the colony layout on the tactical display one final time. Living quarters, research facilities, agricultural domes, open fields, no bunkers, no weapon emplacements, nothing remarkable. This will be the most efficient conquest in our records, he said. In the annals of history, very few predictions would prove quite so spectacularly, so cosmically, so unforgettably wrong. The Vraxian landing craft touched down in 4 separate groups, their rams descending with military precision onto the flat ground east of the colony, conveniently flat ground that Elena had identified, surveyed, and quietly prepared for exactly this purpose 18 months ago. 200 armored soldiers poured out in perfect formation, weapons raised, moving in the clean geometric patterns of a force that had executed this exact maneuver dozens of times before. Their commander on the ground, Lieutenant Drexel, surveyed the colony through advanced targeting optics and found nothing of concern. No resistance, he reported to Kroll. No defensive positions. Sensors read clean. This will be straightforward. As expected, Kroll replied. Proceed. In the colony command center, Elena watched them advance across 4 separate screens and felt a particular stillness that settles over a person when something they have spent years preparing for finally, irrevocably, begins. 7 minutes, she said quietly, starting the timer on her wrist display. Let's be precise. Activate agricultural drones. Across the colony's eastern perimeter, 20 drones that had spent 3 years monitoring crop health and dispersing fertilizer lifted silently from their concealed positions and fanned out in coordinated arcs above the advancing Vraxian formation. Their spray mechanisms had been modified overnight to carry Chen's compound, a fine, pale mist that caught the reddish Kepler sunlight and looked, to every sensor system the Vraxians possess, like perfectly ordinary water vapor. 3 soldiers fired on the nearest drones. 3 drones fell. The others had already completed their dispersal runs and retreated. What is that substance? Drexel demanded as a science officer ran an analysis. Organic trace compounds. Water vapor. Nothing harmful detected. The formation continued forward, unaware that compound A was already working at the molecular level, penetrating the micro-seams of their armor, beginning its slow, irreversible conversation with the alloys beneath. Activate irrigation systems. Beneath the field surrounding the colony, a network of pipes and channels that had never, in 3 years of operation, been used for anything other than watering crops, opened simultaneously. Water flooded into carefully engineered subsurface channels, following gradients that Elena and her engineers had spent months calculating, spreading through the eastern approach terrain with methodical, unstoppable thoroughness. The firm ground became soft. The soft ground became mud. The mud deepened. The Vraxian advance slowed as 200 pairs of armored boots sank into the earth with increasing resistance. 200-pound combat suits, designed for efficiency on stable terrain, became anchors. The neat formation lines dissolved as soldiers scrambled for firmer ground that no longer existed. Flooding the approach, Drexel reported, irritation sharp in his voice. A delaying tactic. Continue advance. They pushed forward, each step harder than the last. Atmospheric analyzers, disrupt frequencies. Throughout the colony, devices that had spent 3 years monitoring air quality and cataloging Kepler's atmospheric composition switched functions without ceremony or announcement. They began broadcasting, precisely, surgically, on the exact frequencies used by Vraxian military communication systems. The effect was immediate and total. Inside Vraxian helmets, the clear command channel dissolved into walls of static. Squad leaders called for their commanders and received noise. Fire teams called for orders and received nothing. 200 soldiers, already slowed by deepening mud, suddenly found themselves operating in informational silence, their coordination unwinding like a rope with a cut strand. Communications compromised, Drexcor's tech specialist reported. Her voice edged with something that might, in a different circumstance, have been called alarm. Source of interference unlocatable. It's coming from everywhere simultaneously. On the inevitable conquest, Crow leaned forward in his command chair. What do you mean, everywhere? No one had a satisfying answer. Weather modification systems. The colony's climate control array, designed to shield crops from Kepler's seasonal atmospheric extremes, activated its secondary configuration. Moisture was drawn rapidly from the surrounding atmosphere and concentrated at low altitude, generating a dense fog bank that rolled over the Vraxian positions with the quiet inevitability of a tide coming in. Within 90 seconds, visibility dropped to near zero. Simultaneously, the array's electrical generation component activated, threading a low-level electromagnetic field through the fog itself. Vraxian sensor systems, the helmet-mounted rangefinders, the tactical mapping equipment, the motion detectors, filled with interference and went dark. 200 soldiers, slowed by mud, cut off from communication, now found themselves standing in a white blindness, unable to see their own hands extended in front of them. Drexcor tried to organize a perimeter hold. He gave orders that half his troops couldn't hear. The formation that had landed with such precision was now a collection of confused clusters, each isolated, each uncertain, each very slowly becoming aware that something had gone profoundly, inexplicably wrong. Pollen distribution systems. It was the quietest of all the activations. The equipment responsible, colony machinery used to manage the pollination of engineered crops, spread across the agricultural domes in an unassuming network of fans and dispersal tubes, began releasing a cloud so fine it was functionally invisible in the fog. Chen's Compound C, concentrated, aerosolized, drifting on the manufactured atmospheric currents directly into the Vraxian positions. The particles were patient. They found cooling vents. They found joint mechanisms. They found weapon ports and sensor arrays and the 1,000 small gaps that exist in any sufficiently complex piece of technology. They settled into these spaces with the quiet efficiency of something that had been precisely engineered for exactly this purpose. And then they began to work. The first report came from a soldier in the front line. My armor, it's stiffening. I can't move my left arm. Then another, weapon targeting system failure. Then, cascading through the Vraxian force like dominoes falling in slow motion, systems shutting down, servos locking, mobility decreasing. 50%, 70, 90. Soldiers who had landed 12 minutes ago as the elite ground forces of a conquering empire now stood frozen in the mud, their advanced combat suits transformed, by agricultural chemistry, into extraordinarily expensive statues. In the command center, Elena watched the sensor readouts and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years. Pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Harvesting team. Deploy. She was already moving. Elena led a team of 12 colonists in modified agricultural harvesting vehicles, broad, heavy machines normally used to collect mature crops. They had spent the previous night being fitted with grappling mechanisms and short-range electromagnetic disruptors. They swept out from the colony's eastern gate in a loose V formation, moving at speed across terrain that their wide-track wheels had been designed to handle, directly into the fog bank in the field of immobilized Vraxian soldiers. It would have been comic under other circumstances. Perhaps it was even now. 200 elite soldiers of the Vraxian Dominion, frozen in place, watching through their one remaining functional sensor as farming equipment bore down on them. Elena's vehicle found Drexcor by his command band insignia. The Vraxian lieutenant was struggling against his armor with the grim determination of a man who refuses to accept what is happening to him even as it happens. He raised his weapon arm. The arm did not rise. Lieutenant Drexcor, Elena said through the vehicle's external speakers, her voice carrying easily through the fog. I'd suggest relaxing. The compound's neurological effects are temporary, but fighting them accelerates the muscle fatigue. The mechanical arm extended from her harvester. It clamped around the lieutenant's armored torso with the matter-of-fact efficiency of something that had spent years picking up large objects and depositing them elsewhere. Drexgor was lifted from the ground. He hung there, suspended from a crop harvester above the muddy soil of Kepler 186F, and said nothing. Because there was nothing adequate to say. Captain Crow. Elena opened a channel on every available frequency, ensuring her voice reached the inevitable Conquest bridge with crystalline clarity. Your ground forces have been neutralized. Your lieutenant is currently a guest aboard our harvesting vehicle. You have two choices: retreat immediately and recover your troops in good health, or remain and explain to your Dominion how you lost 200 elite soldiers to a farming collective. She paused. I suggest you decide quickly. I'm on a schedule. She checked her wrist display. 7 minutes, she said, more quietly, to no one in particular. 3 seconds ahead of projection. A beat. Outstanding. On the bridge of the inevitable Conquest, Captain Crow stared at the tactical display and experienced something that his species had not designed him to process. Complete, total, absolute disbelief. The readouts were clear. 176 of his ground troops were immobilized. Another 24 had attempted retreat and been collected by harvesting vehicles before they reached the landing craft. Drexgor's command signal was broadcasting from inside what the sensors identified as an agricultural storage bay. All of it accomplished in 7 minutes. By farmers. His second-in-command, Vorik, had the wisdom to say nothing. Display the human commander, Kroll said finally. Elena's face filled the screen. Behind her, in the soft lighting of New Opportunities Command Center, Kroll could see colonists moving purposefully, could see his own soldiers being guided, carefully and without violence, toward secured areas by people in agricultural white clothing. The sheer mundanity of the image made it worse. Captain Crow, Elena said pleasantly, your ground forces have been neutralized without a single casualty on either side. I think that reflects well on both of us. Her expression was perfectly, infuriatingly composed. Your options from this position are limited. Orbital bombardment would kill your own personnel. A second landing would meet the same outcome as the first, and this time you've given us warning to prepare improvements. She let that sit. I have a proposal. Crow's mandibles worked silently. You withdraw from this system. Immediately and completely. In exchange, I release your troops once you cleared our long-range sensors. Lieutenant Drexgor remains as our guest for what I anticipate will be brief and productive diplomatic discussions. She tilted her head slightly. Refuse, and I broadcast footage of the past 7 minutes on every open frequency in this sector. I imagine the other powers in the region would find it quite educational. The connection terminated. Kroll sat in his command chair for a long moment. Around him, his officers waited with the careful stillness of subordinates who understand that nothing they say can improve the situation. Begin withdrawal calculations, Kroll said finally. His voice was very controlled. The kind of control that costs a great deal to maintain. Captain, Vorik said carefully, do you want me to record the official after-action report? Kroll looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. I will write it myself. Elena was standing in the courtyard watching the Vraxian ships begin their ponderous turn toward deep space when the priority communication came through. Commander Reyes. The voice was Admiral Wei Chen of Earth Command, no relation to Marcus, and he sounded like a man who had been wakened from sleep by news he was still trying to make sense of. We receive your emergency transmission. A rapid response fleet is en route. ETA 48 hours. Hold out as long as. That won't be necessary, Admiral. A pause. I beg your pardon. The situation has been resolved. A longer pause. Resolved. Our intelligence indicated for Vraxian warships. Your intelligence was correct. They are still there, technically, but they are leaving. Elena watched the distant points of light that were enemy vessels shifting in the reddish sky. Their ground assault has been neutralized. We're holding 176 personnel, and 1 lieutenant pending their complete withdrawal. The silence that followed was long enough that Elena checked the connection. In how long? The Admiral asked finally. 7 minutes. So. Nothing. Then, very quietly. 7 minutes. I can send you the recording if you'd like. Dr. Chen's documentation is quite thorough. Commander Reyes. Admiral Wei Chen's voice had taken on a quality she hadn't heard from a superior officer in quite some time. Something adjacent to wonder. You just defeated a Vraxian assault force on New Opportunity in 7 minutes using agriculture. Adapted defensive infrastructure, Elena corrected mildly. But yes, essentially. In the background of the channel, she heard what sounded like someone putting their head down on a desk. Hold your position, the Admiral said. I'll be in contact. Elena ended the transmission and looked up at the sky. The Vraxian ships were smaller now and getting smaller. Behind her, from inside the command center, a sound began building, uncertain at first, then louder, then full-throated and unmistakable. 50 colonists, who had planted crops and repaired equipment and lived 3 years of ordinary extraordinary life on an alien world, were cheering with everything they had. Elena stood in the courtyard and let the sound wash over her. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd been carrying this moment for a very long time. 3 days after the Vraxian withdrawal, with Lieutenant Drexgor comfortably and securely settled in the guest quarters that had been a seed storage room the week before, Elena called the colony together again in the hydroponics bay. The mood, this time, was different. The fear was gone. In its place was a slightly dazed energy of people who have done something they weren't sure was possible and are still reconciling that with everything they thought they knew. There's more I need to tell you, Elena began. The room settled. My assignment here was not a punishment. It was never a punishment. She looked at the faces arranged before her, people she had worked beside for 3 years, whose names and habits and fears and capabilities she knew with the intimacy of shared purpose. 3 years ago, Earth intelligence detected Vraxian expansion patterns moving through this sector on a trajectory consistent with eventual incursion into human space, rather than escalate directly, which would have been costly, public, and strategically disadvantageous. Earth Command decided on a different approach. She let the quiet stretch for just a moment. We would give them a target they couldn't resist, a colony that looked weak, isolated, and poorly defended, rich in apparent potential but lacking any obvious means of protecting itself. The kind of target a confident, expanding empire couldn't walk past without taking. She looked around the room. New Opportunity was designed from the ground up as precisely that target, and as something else. Dr. Chen stepped forward. My research here was partially funded by Earth's Defense Department from the beginning. The agricultural work was genuine. The crop yield data, the soil adaptation research, all of it is real and has genuine value. But the compounds we developed were always intended for dual application. The local flora of Kepler 186 produces chemical precursors that, when combined with engineered Earth organisms, generate substances with very specific effects on Vraxian military technology. He paused. We needed 3 years to synthesize sufficient quantities and refine the delivery systems. We needed this colony to give us the time and the cover to do that. Governor Mills, who had known the broad strokes since before deployment, sat quietly at the side of the room, watching his people absorb this. You were chosen for this mission, Elena continued, not randomly, not incidentally, but specifically. Every one of you has a dual skill set. Botanists with chemistry specializations, engineers with military systems backgrounds, medical personnel with tactical training. You were selected because you could be both things simultaneously, genuine colonists and, when the moment came, an effective defensive unit. She let that sit. You performed both roles brilliantly. We were bait, someone said. Not angry, just precise. You were the most important part of a 3-year intelligence and defensive operation against the most aggressive expanding power in this sector, Elena replied. You were the proof of concept for an entirely new model of colonial defense. And you were extraordinary at it. A pause. But yes, you were also bait. The silence that followed was a kind that asked to be sat with rather than rushed through. It was Arjun, the young botanist engineer, who spoke first. What happens now? Elena's expression shifted, the composed certainty she carried for 3 years relaxing, very slightly, into something more like candor. Now, she said, New Opportunity becomes what it was always meant to be, openly. Earth's most advanced adaptive defense research outpost. The agricultural work continues. It has genuine scientific value and excellent cover, but our true function becomes officially acknowledged. She looked at the star map behind her, the sector spreading outward in its cold, beautiful complexity. The Vraxians will come back. Smarter next time, with better intelligence and modified equipment. And we need to be ready for them. She looked back at the room. I'd like you all to be part of that. Not as unwitting assets. As colleagues. Another silence. Longer. Then Mills cleared his throat. I think, he said carefully, that we're going to need a better coffee system before I can make any commitments. The laughter, when it came, was genuine and cathartic and went on for quite a while. Within a month, everything had changed. The colony that had been mocked as Earth's greatest failure was now discussed, in defense briefings, in diplomatic communiques, in the hushed and fascinated conversations of military strategists across 3 star systems, as something that might represent the future of how humanity survived in a universe that had never been particularly interested in its continued existence. Earth Defense Force engineers arrived in waves, expanding the facilities and implementing at scale the technologies that had proven so devastatingly effective. New systems were designed and tested. The compounds were refined. The drone networks were expanded. The weather modification array was upgraded to cover twice the ground area in half the time. Lieutenant Garcia, who had failed his combat certification twice, turned out to have an extraordinary intuitive grasp of drone swarm coordination. Dr. Vasquez, the senior agricultural coordinator, developed 2 new compound variants in the first week after the battle. Arjun filed 17 engineering patents in 30 days. The colonists who had spent 3 years being farmers discovered that they had also, quietly and thoroughly, become something else, and that the combination of the 2 things was more powerful than either alone. They called it the Kepler doctrine in the journals and briefing papers, the systematic integration of adaptive defensive technology into civilian infrastructure, using misdirection, environmental modification, and precision chemistry rather than overwhelming firepower to neutralize technologically superior opponents. 3 other colonies began implementing versions of it within weeks of the battle records being declassified. The Vraxian Dominion, meanwhile, went quiet. Intelligence reports painted a picture of an empire experiencing something it had never been designed to handle: institutional doubt. The footage of the 7-minute battle, released, as Elena had threatened, on multiple open frequencies, had created political tremors through the Vraxian military hierarchy. Commanders questioned assumptions they had held for decades. Strategists reviewed 63 years of conquest records looking for cracks they hadn't noticed before. The captured Lieutenant Drexgor, in his diplomatic discussions with Elena and the newly arrived Earth negotiating team, proved surprisingly forthcoming once he accepted that his pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The communication from Earth Command came on a Tuesday morning, while Elena was reviewing new facility expansion plans and drinking coffee that, thanks to a supply upgrade, now tasted of coffee rather than synthetic display. Commander Reyes. Admiral Wei Chen's voice was formal, as it always was on official communications, but underneath the formality there was something else now, a new register of respect that Elena noted without comment. In recognition of your successful defense of new opportunity and the strategic significance of the methodologies employed, you are hereby promoted to the rank of colonel. Furthermore, New Opportunity Station is reclassified, effective immediately, as Earth's Advanced Defense Research Outpost Alpha, with you as a commanding officer. Full rank and resource allocation to follow under separate communication. Thank you, Admiral. The credit belongs to the colony. The colony belongs to your vision, Colonel. Earth Command is aware of that. A pause. 7 minutes. Yes, so. Remarkable. The channel closed. Elena set down her coffee and looked out the viewport at the colony, at the hydroponic gardens and the modified drone bays and the expanded facilities rising against the reddish Kepler sky. At Arjun directing an engineering team on the new atmospheric array installation. At Dr. Chen moving between his lab and the synthesis facility with the focused energy of a man who knows the work he's doing matters. At Mills standing in the garden with his sleeves rolled up, doing something that looked very much like actually farming, which Elena had learned was how he processed complicated emotions. Dr. Chen appeared in her doorway. He leaned against the frame in the way he always did, that particular posture that was simultaneously casual and entirely alert. "Congratulations, Colonel," he said. You knew, Elena said, not turning from the viewport. Didn't you? When it happened. The timing, the progression. You knew it was working exactly as planned. Chen was quiet for a moment. I knew the compounds would work. I had 3 years of data. He paused. But the 7 minutes, was that genuinely the plan, from the beginning? Now Elena turned, and there was something in her expression that Marcus Chen, who had known her for 3 years and worked alongside her with absolute trust, found he had never quite seen before. Not the composed certainty she wore like armor. Something beneath that, something older and more personal and quietly triumphant. I arrived on this planet, she said, with a transport manifest, a colony roster, a terrain map, a 3-year supply projection, and a complete battle plan. She picked up her coffee mug. I knew what the Vraxians would do. I knew how long they would take to get here. I knew what they would see when they looked at us, and what they would assume, and what those assumptions would make them do. She looked at him steadily. 7 minutes wasn't luck, Marcus. It wasn't improvisation. It was a plan, exactly the plan, that I wrote on a ship called the Pilgrim's Hope 18 months before we landed on this rock. Chen studied her for a long moment. The Jupiter incident, he said slowly. 3 admirals. A stolen prototype defense system. A Martian diplomat. An operation, Elena confirmed, to test whether misdirection-based asymmetric defense at the colonial level could work against a superior force. Jupiter was a proof of concept. She set down her mug. New opportunity was the implementation. Marcus Chen looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the viewport at the colony, their colony, the one they had built together, the trap that was also a home, the weapon that was also a garden. And he laughed. It was genuine, and it was odd, and it went on for a surprisingly long time. You complete in total, he started. Careful, Elena said, but she was smiling. How long have you been carrying this? She turned back to the viewport. Outside, in the reddish Kepler light, her people, because they were haze now, and she was theirs, moved through a world they had learned to defend, and to love, and to make bloom. Long enough, she said quietly. The stars were bright above new opportunity. The galaxy, which had always considered them a joke, would have to start choosing different words. Hybrid shadows, where the story never ends where you expect. Everyone in the galactic community had a nickname for it. Earth's embarrassment, the forgotten outpost, the colony that common sense built wrong. But the most popular one, the one whispered by Vraxian war commanders and laughed about in Martian officer lounges alike, was simply the joke. New opportunity. Perched at the razor-thin habitable edge of Kepler 186F, it was, by every measurable standard, humanity's most spectacular failure at interstellar colonization. The funding had been a disaster from the beginning, barely enough to cover basic life support, let alone anything resembling a proper defense grid. When the colony ship had touched down 3 years ago, half the equipment was already outdated before it left Earth's orbit, and the other half had been shaken to pieces during transit. The colonists had spent their first month on an alien world not marveling at the stars, but arguing with warranty departments via 6-hour communication delays. Commander Elena Reyes stood at the narrow viewport of a cramped office, nursing a mug of synthetic coffee that tasted faintly of burnt rubber and broken dreams. Outside, the colony's 50 residents moved methodically through the hydroponic gardens, tending rows of engineered crops beneath Kepler's reddish morning light. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, almost pastoral, the kind of scene that might make a person forget they were standing on a rock at the edge of the known universe with 6 malfunctioning sentry drones as their entire military force. Elena snorted and took another sip. "Checking on your subjects, Commander." The voice floated from the doorway with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped fearing her rank. Dr. Marcus Chen leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, one eyebrow arched with his signature blend of amusement and mild condescension. He was the colony's chief scientist, brilliant, infuriating, and one of approximately 4 people on this entire planet whose company Elena could tolerate for more than 20 minutes. "Just contemplating," Elena replied without turning around, "how spectacularly my career has nosedived." Chen crossed the room and dropped the tablet unceremoniously on her desk. "Governor Mills wants the monthly security assessment." Elena finally turned. The look on her face could have stripped paint. "Security assessment," she repeated slowly, as if tasting each word for poison. For what, exactly? Our overwhelming fighting force of 50 colonists armed with pruning shears? Our fearsome defense grid of 6th-century drones, 3 of which haven't worked since February? Or perhaps our terrifying orbital cannon, which is, and I cannot stress this enough, a modified weather satellite with a larger lens? Chen said nothing. He had learned, over 3 years of proximity to Elena Reyes, that some speeches were best allowed to run their natural course. She gestured toward the viewport with her coffee mug. 3 years ago, I was commanding the flagship defense station over Europa. I had 400 personnel under my command, 12 orbital platforms, and enough firepower to make a Centauran cruiser think twice about its life choices. She paused. Now I'm babysitting farmers at the ass end of the galaxy, writing monthly reports about whether our irrigation pump constitutes a security asset. The official story behind her reassignment was insubordination, a poorly documented incident during what Earth Command diplomatically called the Jupiter Affair. The unofficial story involved 3 admirals, a stolen prototype defense system, a Martian diplomat whose ego had been bruised in ways that would take years to heal, and a classified operation that technically never happened. Elena had never confirmed or denied any of it. She found the ambiguity professionally useful. You know what the worst part is, she continued, sitting down heavily in her chair. Earth Command didn't even bother sending a real military contingent. Just me, Lieutenant Garcia, who failed his combat certification twice, and Officer Patel, who I'm fairly certain applied for this posting because she thought Kepler 186F was closer to the beach resorts on Titan. We're an agricultural research colony, Chen offered mildly. Low priority. Low priority is being generous, Marcus. We're expendable. She stared at the tablet without reading it, though I will admit, whatever you're doing with the local flora out there, it borders on miraculous. The yield data from last quarter was genuinely impressive. Something flickered behind Chen's eyes, brief, carefully controlled, gone before it could be identified. Thank you, he said simply. The local soil composition is surprisingly cooperative. Elena nodded absently, her gaze drifting back to the window. New opportunity was, by any military analysis, nothing. No strategic resources. No rare minerals worth extracting. No tactical position of value. Nothing that any rational, expansion-minded alien empire would bother conquering when there were richer, more impressive targets scattered across the sector. No threat. No value. No point. At least, Elena thought, the ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth. That's what everyone was meant to believe. The klaxon tore through New Opportunities Command Center at precisely 0600 colony time, splitting the early morning quiet like a blade through silk. Elena was already there. She hadn't slept. She hadn't slept a full night since taking this assignment, and lately she had stopped pretending otherwise. The command center's pale blue lighting made everyone look slightly unwell, but on Elena it had long since ceased to matter. She stood at the central console with a posture that suggested she had been carved from the same material as the station walls, immovable, watchful, patient. Lieutenant Garcia stumbled through the doors 30 seconds after the alarm started, still wrestling with the collar of his uniform jacket. His hair suggested he had been asleep approximately 4 minutes ago. Report? Elena said, without looking up. Orbital sensors. He stopped to catch his breath. For Vraxian warships. They just entered the system. At current trajectory, they'll reach orbit in approximately 12 hours. The command center doors opened again. Governor Harlan Mills rushed in like a man who had been running since he heard the word Vraxian, which he probably had. Behind him came Dr. Chen, Senior Agricultural Coordinator Dr. Vasquez, Colony Medic Lieutenant Okafor, and half a dozen other department leads, their faces displaying every shade of panic on the human emotional spectrum. Elena had already pulled up the long-range sensor data. She studied it with the calm expression of someone reading a mildly interesting weather report.